this has been a widely popular tax credit. And basically, the Biden plan is wants to expand this program to provide $5 billion in support every year and actually make the program permanent so communities can take the credit into account in their long-term planning versus how it normally is now, where it's sort of voted in, each year.
Welcome to Buzz House, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started. Today in the Buzz House, Garrick and I will be discussing President-elect Biden's overall housing policy. But before jumping into today's discussion, we want to give you a few updates from around the industry. Deadlines, extensions, and looking at the calendar dominate the news in the housing industry this week. Starting with the eviction moratorium, which is currently set to expire at the end of December, various estimates note that as many as 8 million people in all types of rental housing are facing eviction. Right now, it is not looking like another stimulus package will be passed during the lame duck session, but of course, we'll all be keeping our eyes on that. Various versions of proposed stimulus includes additional direct payments to individuals and also additional emergency rental assistance, which would of course help those at risk of eviction come January. Again, a very highly important item in our industry. Switching to deadlines and so forth with the low-income housing tax credit industry, there's a strong push to the IRS to provide extensions to various deadlines that may be at risk of being met and credits at risk of being recaptured. The IRS came out earlier, of course, in 2020 with Notice 2020-53, which gave extensions for items such as the 10% test until the end of 2020. With the pandemic still causing various delays, projects are, of course, at risk of placing service deadlines as well as 10% tests going into 2021 from various construction delays, if it's obviously COVID-related, materials, people on the job site, and so forth. The National Council of State Housing Agencies sent a letter to the IRS strongly urging to extend the provisions of 2020-53 from December 31st, 2020 to September 30th, 2021 at a minimum, so 9-month extension at a minimum, as well as asking for 4 additional extensions. 2 of these extensions are for an extension of the place in service deadline. Again, many projects reaching the end of the year, perhaps not being placed in service, so a cliff, as well as an extension of non-compliance corrective action period. In other news, Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies' 2020 State of the Nation's Housing Report was recently issued. It notes that despite low interest rates, which of course we've all seen and talked about many times about refinancing and so forth, and continued growth in some sectors, the health and economic consequences of COVID-19, lack of supply, racial tensions, and climate change across the nation have exacerbated the housing affordability crisis. The report shows how federal housing expenditures have not kept up with growing needs and urges policymakers to develop a new comprehensive housing strategy that will reduce inequalities and affordability challenges by providing housing assistance at a scale appropriate to meet the need. One last hot topic also in the LIHTC space is the average income proposed regulations. Many of you know that as income averaging. There are many industry group meetings occurring as we speak to brainstorm on responses to the proposed IRS regulations. There are many concerns being heard from around the industry, so please read the proposed regulations if you haven't, and give us, Garrick and I, or one of the industry associations your comments so we may give the appropriate feedback to the IRS. There are a number of industry groups starting to draft responses here by sometime in December. Again, or please call Garrick and I to discuss. With that, Garrick and I will now jump into President-elect Biden's housing policy. Garrick?
Thanks, Don. So given the election results are basically fundamentally locked in, I wanted to spend some time on this Buzz House to discuss some of the housing policy items from the Biden plan, as well as some of the tax changes which could affect the housing industry or low-income communities. So I wanted to start off with some tax changes, which Biden has emphasized if he can obviously make it through the legislative process once he gets there. The first one was raising the corporate tax rate to 28%. Now, how does this affect housing? Well, I mean, obviously, when it went from 35 down to 21, there was a lot of ramifications that were happening, especially on LIHTC projects and in terms of changing partnership agreements, et cetera. And I know on a lot of projects that I work on now, I mean, there is this, and just, you're projecting out to see what maybe a negative capital account might be, what your exit tax might be at that point. Well, if it was at 21%, now it's at a higher tax rate. Now all of a sudden those expectations have slightly changed. And then from the front end, I mean, you obviously have a higher tax rate. So, the after-tax IRRs are technically going up depending on if the pricing stays the same. So, I mean, this could have an effect of creating more need, obviously, for tax incentivized investing, giving that boost to those programs and offering such in these investments, such as the low-income housing tax credit or even some historic deals. In addition to that 28%, actually, there is also likely imposing a 15% minimum tax on book income. So basically that no corporation is getting away with paying no taxes. So maybe that in combination with all the other things that they have to basically wipe this out, this could cause maybe some more direction from these corporations to go into these tax incentivized investment space. Another tax item which might affect housing is Biden is actually proposing to make, for those who are making actually more than $1 million, to pay the same rate on investment income as they do on their wages. So basically, I would think of it as like capital gains at ordinary rates for those that are making more than $1 million. So it seems like something like this policy could change the level of multifamily asset sales or depending on whether somebody would versus holding on to it. So that remains to be seen, but that is kind of one of the things I thought was kind of interesting out of his tax policy. Additional item is the homebuyer credit, which is sort of set up to help families buy their first home and build wealth by obviously creating new refundable advanceable tax credit of up to $15,000. Whether or not the $15,000 level will remain, it remains to be seen, but that's pretty aggressive. It's supposed to help families obviously offset the cost of home buying, help millions of families lay down roots for the first time. People say if you own your home, obviously that's the step to building wealth. And so obviously this tax credit is building off that temporary tax credit that was expanded on the Recovery Act, but this will be permanent and advanceable. So meaning that home buyers receive the tax credit when they make the purchase instead of waiting to receive the assistance when they actually file the taxes that following year. A different thing that also came up was the renter's tax credit. It's basically a new renter's tax credit to help more low-income families. So apparently Biden's going to work with Congress to enact this renter's tax credit that's supposedly designed to reduce rent and utilities to 30% of income for low-income individuals and families who may make too much money to qualify for, let's say, like a Section 8 voucher, but are still struggling to pay their rent. We know that's, there's a big market there. And he's, apparently going to allocate $5 billion in federal funding for this tax credit every year. So we'll be watching out for that. Also, on the new market tax credit side, which is not necessarily housing, but it's for investment into low-income communities. This has been a widely popular tax credit, and basically the Biden plan is wants to expand this program to provide $5 billion in support every year and actually make the program permanent, so communities can take the credit into account in their long-term planning versus how it normally is now, where it's sort of voted in, each year. And, that's some of the notable items. I'll go over some other items, but I think, Don, you wanted to talk a little bit about the policy items that Biden is trying to propose.
Perfect. Yep. No, thanks, Garrick, for that. Yeah, as Garrick mentioned, right, just kind of delving into President-elect Biden's housing policy. Many of you have seen, $640 billion over 10 years. Those are kind of the numbers that a lot of people, have seen in the press and so forth. I'm just going to touch on 4 or 5 items that we've seen. They're definitely interesting to what our listeners are working on. And then Garrick's going to get a little bit back more into specifically around local housing tax credits and so forth. So with that, the first dollar amount, part of the $640 billion plan, is $65 billion in new incentives for state housing authorities and the Indian Housing Block Grant, which really look to produce housing in areas where affordable housing is in short supply. I mean, that seems kind of simple, but I know there's all kinds of ways to look at where is the need for affordable housing. They're going to direct to communities that are really struggling with the affordability crisis, and those municipalities that are willing to implement new zoning laws that encourage more affordable housing. So kind of an interesting, a few pieces to that policy. Another $10 billion around energy efficiency. I think you're going to see a lot out of the Biden administration looking at greenhouse gas emissions and so forth. So really looking to lower energy bills, lower greenhouse gas emissions, and so forth. So kind of retrofits and whatnot of housing. Another $5 billion would be earmarked towards the increase of affordable housing that would be part of larger community development projects. Many of you might know the program Capital Magnet Funds, which kind of look at maybe some economic development and housing together. Other uses could be localities or municipalities purchasing vacant lots, underdeveloped lots, underutilized properties. So really kind of that tying a little bit more with economic and larger community redevelopment projects. Lastly, I just want to talk another area would be $20 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund. Many of you know that's currently funded through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So this just be another $20 billion for the construction and rehabilitation of affordable housing units. So those are some of the key things that Garrick and I kind of pulled out. In addition to, we're going to transition back to Garrick, really talking more about the LIHTC program and what's maybe within the President-elect Biden's housing plan for that. Garrick.
Yeah, thanks, Don. Yeah, it was exciting. You look through there and you look at somebody's plan, and all of a sudden, what do you see? LIHTC right there in the middle. So, and upon reading it, basically the idea is they want to interject about additional $10 billion investment here, and he wants to expand the low-income housing tax credit program. So some notable items that could come out of this expansion, because we don't really know, there's no real detail on what that entails, but based on all the things that people have been looking for, maybe how this expansion could be additional credits available to the states for 9%, maybe some expansion of fixing that 4% LIHTC credit, and obviously making it easier to construct housing in communities across the country. The Biden administration actually did sort of note in there that they will likely seek greater resources for HUD as well in those programs and project big vouchers, veteran housing, RAD and public housing that obviously goes into some of these LIHTC projects. And, one of the things that I that's actually in the House right now that was quite interesting that Don and I were discussing was some bill that would sort of limit the volume cap of tax exempt bonds that are applied for by housing authorities and sort of give them their own sort of really unlimited volume cap and not affecting what any of the other developers, whether it be for-profit or other nonprofits that are going after. So because you get a lot of states that have backlog in tax-exempt bonds. It's not supposed to be competitive, but they're oversubscribed in a lot of them. And a lot of the oversubscription of it is because there's a lot of housing authorities that are doing a lot of these conversions and are using bonds. So they're eating up a lot of that volume cap. So things like that and the fix and additional LIHTC credits for 9%. I think there's a lot of things that could go there. We just don't know specifically what that $10 billion investment will be used for. So it's going to be interesting as time goes by to figure out exactly where those resources are going to be allocated. In addition, when it comes to sort of expanding sort of community reinvestments in communities across the country, including rural areas and underserved areas, sounds like Biden's trying to expand the funding for the Community Development Financial Institutions Funds, which basically supports like local mission-driven financial institutions in low-income areas around the U.S., including those invested in building new housing in underserved areas. He also wants to expand flexible funding on the community development block grants by an additional $10 billion over 10 years. So these CDBG grant funds, obviously, it funds local efforts typically to expand affordable housing. It improves infrastructure and it increases economic opportunities for low-income individuals and communities. So that sounds like definitely some good policy there. For rural and like really hard poverty-stricken areas, I know that he wants to ensure rural communities have access to affordable and accessible homes. So they're trying to, increase funding for needed repairs, affordable rental housing properties, the construction of new properties through the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Rural Housing Service, including multifamily direct loans and single-family direct loan programs, which I guess the October 2030 plan has already been applied to a number of the rural development programs in order to ensure funds are dedicated to serving those families living in these areas facing persistent poverty. But as President Biden said, he wants to apply that plan to all federal programs. So what that specifically means, we won't know, but that's the sort of idea. Down to the local, state, and housing regulations, it sounds like Biden's plan wants to eliminate the local and state housing regulations that limit affordable housing options and contribute to the typical urban sprawl. So, in order to do this, he wants to tie new federal investments in housing to a requirement that states and localities eliminate regulations that reduce that availability of affordable housing and contribute to that sprawl. So that should be interesting, sort of tying it there. And that might be the catalyst that'll help, lift some of these regulations. And lastly, I think Biden was trying to also expand in the local housing policy grants in order to give some states and localities the technical assistance and planning support they need to sort of modernize their housing regulations. Because as you all know, you start going through, some of these are just ad hoc, they're putting Band-Aids there and it's just cut and paste. And I think that's probably a good strategy, in my view. That's pretty much it. I mean, there's a lot of other things that we didn't really touch on, but we thought these were some of the more pointed things toward the housing industry and kind of the whole subsidized housing, especially LIHTC, et cetera, that we thought were pertinent. So I'll leave it back to you, Don.
Garrick, no, thanks. That's a lot of good stuff, and kind of those on the housing policy. Definitely looking forward to seeing what potentially could come to fruition going forward here. As Garrick kind of mentioned, and as many of you listeners know, the fixed 4% is probably first and foremost on everyone's mind in the low housing tax credit space. And we're even watching if there's a chance, many times here during the lame duck, there could be, or at the end of a year, some tax extenders, some tax extender bills and so forth. If there's a vehicle to attach a 4% fixed, the industry is ready to push for that. So we'll kind of keep everyone up to date on anything that could happen here in the next 30 plus days and so forth. But again, that is in fact number one, I think, on everyone's mind. Thank you, listeners, very much for listening today, and we'll be back with you soon. Thank you for listening to Buzzhouse. To receive a notification when new episodes are available, please subscribe to Buzzhouse, a Baker Tilly podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. And if you have a suggested topic, please send them to build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD @bakertilly.com.